The warp is a mirror, though most are too terrified to look into it. It reflects our sins, yes, but sometimes it reaches into the never-was and pulls back something that shouldn't exist. I've watched the XII Legion for 10,000 years. I've seen them weep red tears on Isfahan and heard their broken anthems on Scalathrax. They're a legion of ghosts led by a monster. But imagine for a moment a different shadow falling across the deck of the Conqueror. The nails are screaming. The air smells of ozone and ancient Mediterranean salt. A crack forms in the reality of the hull. Not a breach of the Geller field, but puncture in the fabric of fate itself. Out steps a man who has already murdered a Pantheon. He is pale as ash, marked by a streak of blood that will never wash away, and he carries blades chained to his very soul. The World Eaters think they know rage. They think they have mastered the art to kill. But what happens when the hounds of war encounter a god of it? What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? Take a breath, traveler. The air is about to get very thin. The Conqueror was never a silent ship. It breathed with a low, rhythmic grind of the butcher's nails, a collective hum of neurological agony shared by 30,000 warriors. But then, the screaming started. Not the scream of a man, but of reality itself. In the heart of the secondary docking bay, the air didn't just thin, it shattered like frosted glass. A localized rift, jagged and bleeding a strange, golden light, tore through the reinforced deck plating. The Geller field didn't flicker. It simply failed to recognize the intrusion. This wasn't the warp. This was something older, something primal. From the center of the golden fracture, a silhouette emerged, heavy and deliberate. As the rift sealed with a thunderous crack that sent tremors through the ship's spine, a single figure remained, kneeling in the center of the scorched metal, his breathing the only sound in the sudden, terrifying silence. Khorne was the first to arrive, his chain-axe gore-child already thrumming with a hungry, low-end growl. He expected a demonic incursion, some warp-spawn horror, or perhaps a wayward chrono glitch from the Dark Age. What he found was a man, or at least the shape of one. The stranger was hulking, his skin the color of sun-bleached bone, coated in a fine layer of ash that refused to drift away in the ship's artificial gale. A crimson tattoo, jagged and fierce, cut across his torso, and I like a permanent scar of blood. He wore leather and bronze that belonged in a museum of ancient Terra, and yet the sheer presence of him hit Khorne's senses like a physical blow. Most hauntingly, the nails in Khorne's skull, those twitching, biting engines of ruin, went deathly cold. For the first time in decades, there was no ticking, only a void. "Who are you?" Khorne's voice was a vox-distorted growl, cautious in a way he hadn't been since he first met Angron on the sands of Nysiria. The stranger rose slowly, his muscles rippling like corded steel under that ghostly skin. He didn't look at the bolters leveled at his chest or the chains words revving in the hands of the surrounding World Eaters. His eyes were deep-set pits of weary, volcanic embers, looking past the steel walls of the Conqueror as if searching for a horizon that no longer existed. He reached back, his hands grasping two hilts wrapped in heavy, blackened chains that were fused to his forearms. The air around those blades began to shimmer, the temperature in the bay skyrocketing until the Promethean pipes overhead groaned under the thermal expansion. A young initiate, his mind already frayed by the butcher's nails, couldn't endure the silence. With a guttural roar, he lunged, his chains words screaming for the stranger's neck. The movement was a blur, not the frantic twitch speed of the Astartes, but something heavier, more calculated. The stranger didn't parry. He moved through the attack. One of the chain blades whipped outward, trailing a wake of liquid fire that smelled of sulfur and ancient pyres. It didn't just cut through the initiate's power armor. It vaporized the ceramite and the bone beneath it in a single, fluid arc. The World Eater was dead before his boots left the ground, his body hitting the deck as a charred husk. The stranger didn't even look at the corpse. He simply retracted the chain with a metallic clatter that sounded like a funeral bell. The deck erupted. The World Eaters, driven by the sudden violent death of their brother and the maddening silence of their own nails, surged forward in a wave of blue and white plate. But Khorne stayed his hand. He watched the stranger, the Spartan, dance a macabre ballet of fire and iron. Every strike was a lesson in economy. Every movement was the death of a godslayer in the making. The stranger wasn't fighting like a berserker. He was fighting like a man who had already killed everything worth killing and found a task beneath him. As the Spartan stood amidst the mounting pile of legionary corpses, he looked directly at Khorne. In that moment, the captain of the 8th realized a terrifying truth. The World Eaters hadn't captured a prisoner. They had invited a predator into a cage filled. The heavy blast doors of the Conqueror's strategic sanctum didn't just open. They were buckled inward by a psychic pressure that tasted of copper and old grief. Angron, the Red Angel, stood at the threshold. He was a mountain of scarred meat and copper cabling, the butcher's nails in his skull twitching like a nest of disturbed vipers. Usually, the presence of his sons was a cacophony that fueled his desire to level the ship, but today, he felt a strange, localized pocket of silence. He looked down at the pale creature, standing among the smoking remains of his honor guard. Kratos did not flinch. He did not offer the frantic, terrified submission of mortal, nor the programmed defiance in Astartes. He stood as a man who had seen the foundations of the world crumble and found the rubble more useful than the structure. For a long, agonizing minute, the pre-march and Spartans simply stared. Two broken mirrors reflecting the same image of eternal war. "You are not of the stars-born rot," Angron rumbled, his voice a landslide of grinding tectonic plates. He stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his sheer mass. He leaned down, his face, a map of 1,000 wars, mere inches from Kratos' ashen features. The nails in Angron's brain were screaming, demanding he tear this anomaly limb from limb, yet a flicker of something long buried stayed his hand. It was recognition. He saw the marks on Kratos' arms, the way the skin was seared where the chains met the bone, and he knew that heat. It was the heat of the arena. It was the mark of a slave who had turned his chains into his salvation. "Who was your master?" Angron spat, the question more of a challenge than a query. "Which high-riding bastard claims your soul?" Kratos' eyes didn't waver. They were the eyes of a predator that had outlived its pack. "I have no master," the Spartan replied, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very bulkheads of the ship. "The ones who claim to be my masters are dead. I buried them in the ruins of their own palaces." A collective gasp rippled to the gathered World Eaters, a blasphemy so pure it almost sounded like a prayer. To speak of slaying gods in the presence of a pre-march, the literal son of a living god, was to invite immediate annihilation. But Angron didn't strike. Instead, he let out a sound that might have been a laugh if his throat weren't so choked with scar tissue. It was a dry, hacking bark of grim approval. He recognized the tone. It was the tone of a man who had looked at the heavens and found them wanting. "They say I am a god," Angron whispered. A dangerous edge returned to his tone as he towered over Kratos, his massive shadow swallowing the Spartan whole. "They say my father is the emperor of mankind. They say I owe him my life, my blood, my very will." He reached out a massive, gauntlet hand, his fingers twitching near the hilt of his chain axe. Kratos didn't reach for his blades. He simply shifted his weight, a subtle movement that signaled he was ready to die to prove his independence. What is a god to a man who has felt their breath on his neck and cut their throats anyway? Kratos asked. The question hung in the air like a death sentence. It was a philosophical hand grenade thrown into the heart of a legion that was already losing its mind to the warp. The tension snapped not with a blow, but with a command. Angron turned away, his cape of human skins trailing behind him. "Get him armor," the pre-march growled over his shoulder. "Give him a place in the line. I want to see if this Godslayer can bleed for a cause that isn't his own." Khorne stepped forward, the silent nails in his head finally beginning to hum with new, focused intensity. Kratos watched the Red Angel depart, his expression unreadable. He knew this game. He had been a general once. He had led men to their deaths for the amusement of the heavens. As he looked at the red and white warriors surrounding him, he didn't see allies. He saw a mirror of his own past, a legion of Spartans who had traded their souls for a rage they couldn't control. And for the first time in eternity, the Ghost of Sparta felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost. The planet of Armatura didn't just burn, it screamed. The Shadow Crusade had arrived, and with it, the XII Legion. From the assault ram to the Conqueror, The World Eaters descended like a localized hurricane of white and blue steel. But among them, a different kind of storm took shape. Kratos did not use a jump pack, nor did he wait for the roar of the drop pod to clear. He leaped from a low-orbit gunship, a falling star of ash and rage, crashing into the center of an Ultramarine's defensive line with the force of a tectonic shift. The dust hadn't even settled before the first fountain of blood hit the air. The Ultramarines, masters of the theoretical and practical, found no logic in the man before them. He was a ghost in the machine, a relic of a mythic past tearing to the high-tech precision of the XIII Legion with nothing but two blades and an incandescent, focused hatred. To the World Eaters fighting nearby, the sight was transformative. They were used to the chaotic, stumbling frenzy of the nails, a blind lashing out that often left them vulnerable. Kratos was different. He was a masterclass in lethality. He moved with a terrifying rhythmic cadence, his blades carving arcs of fire that didn't just kill, they dismembered with surgical intent. When an Ultramarine sergeant leveled a power sword at his throat, Kratos didn't just parry. He caught the blade in his bare, ash-stained palm, the power field hissing against his divine flesh. With a guttural roar, he wrenched the weapon away and drove his own elbow into the warrior's faceplate, shattering the reinforced plasteel and the skull beneath it in a single, sickening crunch. The World Eaters paused, their own madness momentarily quelled by the sheer, cold purity of the Spartan's violence. Look at him. Khorne bellowed over the Vox, his chain axe cleaving through a tactical squad. He does not waste his breath on screams. He does not let the itch rule the hand. It was a revelation. The younger initiates, those whose minds hadn't yet been completely eroded by the butcher's nails, began to watch the Spartan's movements. They saw how he used the chains to control the battlefield, pulling enemies into his reach or swinging them like ragdolls into their own ranks. A subconscious shift began to occur within the XII Legion. The frantic tick-tick-tick of the nails seemed to synchronize with the heavy, booming pulse of Kratos' own heart. They weren't just killing anymore. They were hunting. The blind rage of Khorne was being sharpened into a focused wrath, a weapon that could be aimed rather than just unleashed. In the center of the capital city's plaza, Kratos found himself face-to-face with a Contemptor dreadnought. The ancient walker's twin-linked lascannons glowed with lethal intent. Any other warrior would have sought cover. The World Eaters would have charged headlong and died in the hundreds. Kratos simply ran. He sprinted through a hail of fire, his skin smoking where the grazing beams touched him. He leaped, the chains of the blades of chaos extending to their limit, hooking into the dreadnought's sarcophagus. With a feat of strength that defied the laws of biology, he swung himself around the machine's back, his blades biting deep into the exposed power coils. The explosion was a blinding white sun, and as the smoke cleared, the Spartan emerged from the wreckage, dripping in hydraulic fluid and blood, holding the head of the interred hero like a trophy of a forgotten war. As the sun set over the ruined spires of Armatura, the battlefield grew strangely quiet. The World Eaters stood among the mountains of the dead, their white armor stained a deep, permanent crimson. They didn't howl at the moon. They didn't fight each other for scraps of meat. They looked to the Spartan, who sat on the remains of a fallen Titan's foot, calmly cleaning the blood from his forearms with a piece of discarded ultramarine banner. He looked at them, these monsters who called themselves his brothers, and saw the same emptiness he had felt after the fall of Olympus. He had given them a moment of clarity, but in this galaxy, clarity was a curse. The war is not won by the loudest scream, Kratos said, his voice carrying through the silence of the dead. It is won by the man who can still see his enemy when his eyes are full of blood. The Conqueror had become a temple of a different sort. The pits, once echoing with the mindless shrieks of gladiatorial slaughter, were now filled with a heavy, rhythmic chanting. It wasn't the praise of Khorne, nor the battle hymns of the Imperium. It was a low, guttural cadence of Spartan discipline. The younger initiates, those whose frontal lobes hadn't yet been completely devoured by the butcher's nails, had begun to follow Kratos with devotion that bordered on the religious. They saw in him something the Red Angel could never provide, a way to live with the pain rather than for it. They began to etch his symbols into their ceramite, painting long, jagged red streaks across their left pauldrons and helmets. They called themselves the Ghost Stalkers, and they were the first signs of schism that would soon bleed the XII Legion white. Kratos did not ask for their worship. In fact, he met it with a cold, abrasive contempt. He treated the Astartes not as sons or brothers, but as failing soldiers. In the training cages, he didn't use the blades of chaos. He used a simple, weighted practice staff. He broke their ribs, shattered their kneecaps, and laid them low, not out of malice, but to teach them the value of a guard that never drops. "The nails are a leash held by a coward," he would growl, standing over a bleeding sergeant. "You let a machine tell you when to be angry. A true warrior commands his own blood." This philosophy was poison to the old guard of the Legion, those veterans who had fully surrendered to the great tick of the nails. To them, Kratos wasn't a savior. He was a heretic who was stealing the Legion's birthright of madness. Khorne found himself caught in the crushing gravity between two suns. On one side was Angron, his father, a being of pure, unadulterated suffering who demanded the Legion burn with him. On the other was Kratos, a man who seemed to offer a path back to the stoicism of the war hounds of old. Khorne watched as his brothers stopped eating in the mess halls, choosing instead to sit in silence, sharpening their blades by hand rather than using the auto-grinders. The air on the ship had changed. It was no longer charged with the frantic energy of a powder keg. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness before a tidal wave. Khorne felt the nails in his own skull protesting this new order, biting deep into his mind, as if sensing that their grip on the 12 was slipping. The word-bearers, ever the vultures of the soul, were the first to voice their concern. Erebus himself walked the decks of the Conqueror, his tattooed face twisted in a mask of feigned brotherly worry. He saw the red-striped armor and the cold, focused eyes of the ghost stalkers, and felt a chill that even the warp couldn't provide. This Spartan was a blank of the spirit. He didn't just resist the influence of the dark gods. He seemed to ignore them entirely. "You are cultivating a tumor, Khorne," Erebus whispered, his voice like silk over a razor. "This outlander is teaching your men to control their rage." But Khorne does not want controlled rage. He wants the harvest. Khorne didn't respond, his hand tightening on Gorechild. He was beginning to realize that the Spartan wasn't just changing the Legion. He was breaking the very laws of the universe they had sworn to serve. The breaking point came during the muster for the siege of Sarum. A veteran captain, a man whose mind was little more than a scream, challenged Kratos in the center of the embarkation deck. He accused the Spartan of cowardice, of weakening the Legion's spirit by stifling the nails. Kratos didn't speak. He didn't even draw a weapon. As the captain lunged with chainsward, Kratos stepped inside the ark, caught the warrior's throat in one hand, and squeezed. The sound of reinforced ceramite collapsing under the strength of a demigod was like a thunderclap. Kratos held the dying warrior aloft, looking into the eyes of the hundreds of world eaters watching. "I am not your master," he said, his voice echoing through the hangar, "and I am not your god. But if you wish to die like animals, I will happy to oblige you." He dropped the body and walked away, leaving a Legion that was now irrevocably divided. Sarum was a world of screaming iron and black soot, a forged fortress that had forgotten the sun. The 12 Legion descended upon its jagged spires not as liberators, but as a wrecking ball. Amidst the rain of molten slag, Kratos moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency that made the frantic butchery of the world eaters look amateurish. The Mechanicum's Skitarii cohorts leveled their radium carbines, but the Spartan was a blur of ash-white skin and trailing fire. He didn't just breach the outer gates. He tore them from their hinges using the chains of his blades as winches, dragging the massive adamantium slabs down into the dust. To Kratos, this wasn't a holy forge or a bastion of ancient technology. It was just another labyrinth built by men who worshipped tools they didn't understand. As they pushed into the heart of the manufactorum, a shadow fell over the Spartan, a warhound titan, its chassis corrupted by scrap code and dark scrap iron, stepped from the haze. Its plasma blast gun hissed with the heat of a captured star. The world eaters around Kratos scrambled for cover, their nails sparking in a frenzy of survival terror. But Kratos stood his ground. He looked up at the god machine, his eyes reflecting the blue glow of the plasma coil. He had toppled colossi that stood higher than any spire on Sarum. He had wrestled with titans whose footsteps moved tectonic plates. To him, this god machine was merely a puppet of steel. With a roar that drowned out the Titan's vox horn, he leaped, his chains snapping outward like striking vipers, seeking purchase on the machine's massive knee joints. The battle was a symphony of grinding gears and divine fury. Kratos didn't use meltas or lost cannons. He used the Titan's own momentum against it. He swung through the air, a pendulum of death, his blades biting deep into thick hydraulic lines of the warhound's legs. When the machine tried to stomp him into the blackened earth, he caught the foot, 1,000 tons of crushing pressure, and held it. His muscles bulged, his skin glowing with a faint, golden ichor as he strained against the mechanical god. With a guttural heave, he wrenched the leg upward, destabilizing the walker. As the warhound began its slow, agonizing tilt toward the ground, Kratos pulled himself up to the cockpit, shattering the reinforced armor glass with a single ashen fist. Inside the command bridge, the princeps was fused to his chair by wires in madness. He stared at the Spartan, a man who looked like an ancient myth birthed into a nightmare of oil and chrome. Kratos didn't offer a warrior's death. He reached into the command console and pulled out a shimmering, pulsing core, a fragment of STC, or perhaps something darker, a relic that hummed with frequency that made his very soul ache. It reminded him of Pandora's box, a vessel of power that promised everything and delivered only ruin. For a moment, the Spartan hesitated. The power within the relic was immense, enough to tip the scales of the Shadow Crusade. He looked at his reflection in the polished brass of the core and saw not a hero, but a weapon. The warhound detonated, a pillar of fire that lit the Sarum sky for miles. From the wreckage walked Kratos, the glowing relic in one hand and a blade of chaos in the other. He found himself surrounded by his ghost stalkers, their red-striped helmets bowed in silent awe. They had watched a man kill a god of iron with his bare hands. The sinking of their nails had reached a fever pitch. They no longer felt the erratic tick of Khorne, but the steady, heavy thump of the Spartan's own heartbeat. Kratos looked at the relic, then back at the burning forge world. He didn't give the prize to the Mechanicum or his legion. He crushed it. He ground the ancient technology into the dirt under his heel. Power is not a gift, he told the silent warriors. It is a cage. Never forget that the warp does not just surround a ship. It breathes through it. Following the destruction of the Sarum relic, the Conqueror was plunged into a nightmare of crimson. The Geller field didn't fail. It was simply ignored by the entity that claimed the XII Legion as its own. Kratos awoke not in his quarters, but in a realm where the sky was the color of fresh bruise and the ground was composed of 1 billion interlocking skulls. This was the brass citadel. At the horizon, a throne of jagged metal rose higher than any mountain on earth, and upon it sat a shadow so vast it blotted out the very concept of hope. Khorne did not speak in words. He spoke in the vibration of every drop of blood ever spilled in the history of existence. The blood god had found a new candidate for his mantle, and he was not accustomed to being kept waiting. Kratos stood alone on the field of bone, the blades of chaos hissing as they touched the corrupted air of the Empyrean. From the red mist emerged a bloodthirster of the insensate rage, a greater demon the size of a half-block, its wings casting a shadow of leathery death. The beast didn't roar. It projected a psychic wave of every murder Kratos had ever committed, forcing him to relive the screams of his wife and daughter, the burning of Athens and the cold eyes of Athena. It was an invitation to surrender to the numbness of the slaughter, to let the great tick of the universe take the wheel. The demon swung a great axe of brass, a blow meant to cleave worlds, but Kratos met the edge with his bare forearms. The impact sent a shockwave through the warp, shattering the skulls beneath them into a fine, white powder. I have heard the voices of God before, Kratos spat, his voice cutting through the psychic roar of the blood god's domain. He wrapped his chains around the demon's throat, pulling the titan-sized horror down to his level. They all speak of destiny while they hide behind their walls. You are no different. You are just another parasite feeding on the grief of man. He drove a blade into the demon's chest, the Greek fire of the blades reacting violently with the warped stuff of the beast's heart. This wasn't just a physical fight. It was a metaphysical rejection. Khorne offered Kratos the power to burn the galaxy, to replace Angron, to become the true avatar of war. But Kratos saw the brass throne for what it was, a pile of refuse built by a king too afraid to fight his own battles. The bloodthirster shrieked as Kratos began to literally tear it apart, piece by bloody piece. He didn't use the rage of the nails. He used the cold, calculating fury of a man who had survived a suicide. He ripped the demon's horns from its skull and used them to pin the creature to the floor of its own master's realm. As the beast dissolved into ichor, the sky above the brass citadel began to crack. Khorne's displeasure manifested as a rain of boiling blood, each drop heavy enough to crush a mortal man. The blood god reached down a hand of iron and fire, but Kratos didn't cower. He looked into the void where a face should be and laughed, a dry, hollow sound. He had killed the fates. He had outrun the cycle of his own world. He would not be a trophy in this one. The vision shattered. Kratos gasped as he returned to the physical world, his boots hitting the deck of the Conqueror. He was covered in a red residue that smelled of ozone and ancient copper, but his eyes were clear. Around him, the world eaters were collapsing, their nails firing in a sympathetic response to the blood god's fury. Only the ghost stalkers remained standing, though they trembled with the effort. Kratos looked at his hands. The chains were no longer just black and iron. They were etched with a faint, flickering Greek script that pulsed with a light the warp could not touch. He had parried a god, but he knew the cost. Khorne was a patient hunter, and by rejecting the gift, Kratos had turned to 12. The Conqueror was a ship divided by two different kinds of silence. In the lower decks, the ghost stalkers sat in meditative vigils, but in the upper sanctums, the silence was a hell breath of a predator. Angron was dying, not in body, but in essence. The butcher's nails were no longer mere implants. They were becoming a metaphysical cancer, tunneling through his soul to create a doorway for the blood god. The pre-march sat in a throne of jagged scrap, his breathing a wet, mechanical rattle. He looked at Kratos, who had entered the chamber unbidden, with eyes that were no longer human. They were pits of liquid gore. The buzzing, Angron whispered, a sound like grinding stones. It's stopping. He is coming for me, Spartan. The red sands. I can see them again. Kratos stepped over the piles of discarded, broken weaponry that littered the floor. He knew this scent, the smell of a man being hollowed out to serve as a vessel for a divinity. He had seen it in the mirror when he wore the mantle of Ares. He is not coming to save you, Angron, Kratos said, his voice devoid of pity but heavy with a grim understanding. He is coming to claim the debt. You are a slave who thinks he is a king because his chains are made of gold and fury. Angron lunged then, a blurred mountain of muscle and rage. He didn't use a blade. He used his hands, catching Kratos by the throat and slamming him through a reinforced bulkhead. The ship groaned as the two titans traded blows that would have leveled a fortress. The duel was not a display of skill, but a dialogue of shared trauma. Every time Kratos struck the pre-march, he felt the vibration of the nails, a rhythmic, agonizing scream that echoed his own past. He saw the gladiatorial pits in Assyria. He saw the friends Angron had lost. He saw the betrayal of an emperor who had stolen a warrior's right to die with his kin. Kratos didn't fight back with hate. He fought with the cold, hard mercy of a headsman. He used the chains of the blades of chaos to bind Angron's arms, the Greek fire searing the Primarch's corrupted flesh. Look at me. Kratos roared, pinning the giant against the hull. Choose. Die as a man or live as a puppet for eternity. I offer you the end you were denied on your home world. For a single, fleeting second, the madness in Angron's eyes cleared. The great tick stopped. He looked at the Spartan, and for the first time, the red angel wept, tears of clear water that cut through the crust of dry blood on his cheeks. Kill me, he gasped, his voice small, the voice of the slave boy who just wanted to sleep. Kratos raised a blade, the metal glowing with a white-hot purity, aiming for the cluster of the nails at the base of the Primarch's skull. It was a mercy killing that would have changed the fate of the galaxy, a final act of defiance against the dark gods. But the universe has a way of protecting its monsters. The air in the room turned to lead as a psychic barrier erupted between them. Lorgar Aurelian, the Golden Apostle, stepped from the shadows, his mace illuminarium glowing with a sickly, iridescent light. No, Spartan, Lorgar whispered, his face a mask of tragic certainty. His ascension is written in the stars. You are a footnote in a history you do not understand. With a wave of his hand, Lorgar threw Kratos through the viewport, The vacuum of space howling as the Spartan was sucked into the void. As Kratos tumbled into the cold dark, he saw through the shattering glass the transformation begin. Angron's body began to swell, wings of shadow tearing from his back. The Spartan had tried to kill a god, but he had forgotten that in this reality, the gods do not allow their toys to break so easily. The void of space is not empty. It is a cold, hungering throat. But for a man who had climbed out of the depth of Hades, the vacuum was merely another path. Kratos did not die in the silence. He drifted, a speck of ash-white defiance against the backdrop of a dying sun, until the warp currents, drawn to his concentrated density of soul, pulled him back into the Conqueror's shadow. He did not return as a guest. He smashed the hull of the lower decks like a meteoric strike, his skin frosted with crystalline oxygen and his eyes burning with a rejuvenated, lethal clarity. He had seen the gods of this realm through the eyes of the abyss, and he recognized the stench. They were not divine. They were the same petty, narcissistic tyrants he had butchered on Olympus, merely wearing larger masks of cosmic horror. The Conqueror was no longer a ship. It was a cathedral of meat. The ascension of Angron had turned the XII Legion into a screaming hive of madness. But in the subsectors, the ghost stalkers waited. When Kratos emerged from the breach, they did not kneel. They stood, their red-striped armor caked in the gore of the true world eaters they had been forced to execute in the Spartans' absence. Kratos looked at them, his accidental legion, and saw the burden of leadership he had once tried to outrun. "The Golden One calls this destiny," Kratos growled, gesturing toward the upper decks where Lorger's chants echoed. "He says your fate is to be fuel for a fire that never warms. I say fate is a lie told by the fearful to justify their chains." He led them not toward the bridge, but toward the warp core. If the gods of this realm wanted a war, he would give them one they had never seen, a god hunt. Kratos began to use the warp against itself. He understood now that the Empyrean responded to will and symbolism. He didn't just swing his blades. He projected his history, the weight of 1,000 fallen temples, into every strike. When word-bearers came to reclaim the heretics, Kratos met them with a savagery that made the butcher's nails look like a lullaby. He moved like the shadow of Ares, a blurring cyclone of chains and fire that left nothing but scorched ceramite and silenced prayers in his wake. He wasn't just killing soldiers. He was erasing the influence of the four from the very air of the ship. The word-bearer sorcerers tried to bind him with hexes, screaming the names of the dark gods to shatter his mind. Kratos simply walked through their spells, the Greek runes on his blades glowing with a blinding anti-warp radiance. He reached the lead sorcerer, a creature bloated on the promises of Tsench, and caught him by the jaw. "Your gods are silent when I speak," Kratos whispered, his voice vibrating with a frequency that caused the nearby monitors to shatter. He tore the sorcerer's head from his shoulders and tossed it into the warp vent. He was the anomaly, the variable that the great game had not accounted for. He was a predator from a dead world, hunting in a jungle that thought it was the top of the food chain. The ship groaned as Kratos reached the inner sanctum of the Conqueror's engine room. He stood before the pulsing heart of the vessel, the warp drive, which now looked like a weeping eye of raw energy. He knew that by destroying this, he would strand the Legion in the deep dark, perhaps forever. He looked at Khorne, who stood at the threshold, his helmet lenses flickering with a dying light. The captain was a man torn between two hells. Kratos held a blade of chaos over the core, the fire of the blade reflecting in the warp eye. "The hunt begins here," Kratos said, his gaze fixed on the screaming vortex. "We will not go to Terra to serve a corpse or a demon. We will go into the eye, and we will show your gods why men used to fear the dark." The Conqueror was no longer a vessel of the void. It was a screaming organ of the warp, a titanic lung breathing in the madness of the Empyrean. As the ship drifted toward the edge of the Eye of Terror, the ghost stalkers found themselves besieged not by an external enemy, but by their own brothers. The true world eaters, now fully possessed by the murderous whims of the ascended Angron, swarmed the lower decks in a tide of gore-slicked ceramite. They were no longer warriors. They were meat puppets for Khorne's amusement. Kratos stood at the center of the engine room's primary catwalk, his blades weaving a tapestry of fire that kept the darkness at bay. He realized then that he could not save this legion. To save a man from a burning house is noble, To save a man who had become the fire itself is impossible. Khorne. Kratos' voice bellowed over the roar of the warp drive. The captain of the Eight stood a dozen paces away, his body trembling as the butcher's nails fought for control. Gorchild was revving with a pitch that suggested the weapon itself was screaming in agony. Khorne looked at the Spartan, then at the horde of his brothers tearing each other apart in the shadows below. The tragedy of the XII Legion was written in the blood on his hands. "It is over, Spartan," Khorne croaked, the Vox in his helmet sparking. "The Red Angel has flown. We are the ash he left behind." Kratos stepped forward, the heat from his blades melting the deck plating. "Then let the ash be scattered," the Spartan replied. "Better to be nothing than to be his." The confrontation was a collision of two eras of tragedy. Kratos moved with the weight of a pantheon's death behind him, while Khorne fought with the desperate, frantic speed of a man trying to outrun his own mind. Gorchild bit into Kratos' shoulder, the teeth of the axe grinding against the bone of a demigod, spraying golden ichor across the deck. Kratos didn't flinch. He grabbed the shaft of the axe, pulling Khorne closer until their eye lenses met. In that moment, Kratos didn't see an enemy. He saw himself before the suicide on the cliffs of Greece. He saw a man who had been used until there was nothing left but a scar. With a roar of "enough!" Kratos drove his forehead into Khorne's, the impact cracking the captain's helmet and sending him spiraling into the darkness of the subdecks. With the path clear, Kratos turned to the warp core, the weeping, pulsating eye of the ship. He wrapped the chains of the blades of chaos around the central cooling pylons, his skin turning a translucent, fiery gold as he channeled every ounce of divine lineage into the strike. He wasn't just breaking a machine, he was severing a tether. He was a fate breaker, and he would not allow this ship to reach Terra. He would not allow this legion to become the eternal joke of the dark gods. As he pulled, the pylons groaned, the reality-warping energies of the core beginning to bleed into the physical world, disintegrating everything they touched. The screams of the demons within the engine grew into a cacophony of terror as they realized the Spartan intended to take them all into the silence of the great void. The Conqueror buckled. The ship's spine snapped as the engine room collapsed into a localized singularity. Kratos stood at the center of the implosion, a pillar of unyielding white, as amidst a whirlwind of collapsing metal and screaming souls. He saw the Ghost Stalkers one last time, their red-striped helmets bowed as the fire consumed them. They died not as madmen, but as soldiers of Spartan who had given them the only gift he had left, an end. As the engine room vanished into a white-hot flash of annihilation, Kratos felt a familiar pull of the abyss. He had burned his second life to ash just as he had his first. The butcher's end was not a victory. It was a funeral pyre for a legion that had been born in blood and would finally be allowed to turn to dust. The 41st Millennium is a graveyard that refuses to stay silent. 10,000 years have passed since the Conqueror was torn asunder, yet the echoes of that night still ripple through the Empyrean like a recurring fever dream. The world eaters of the modern age are a fractured brotherhood of butchers, following the demon primarch Angron into a never-ending cycle of senseless bloodletting. But among the warband of the Eye of Terror, a whisper persists, a legend told by the oldest Long War veterans and the most terrified of cultists. They speak of a gray giant, a phantom marked by a streak of dried blood, who appears not when the slaughter begins, but when it is at its most chaotic. He does not fight for the throne, nor for the dark gods. He hunts the hunters. In the deep, cold reaches of the Segmentum Obscurus, a warband of Khorne berserkers recently found themselves cornered within a derelict space hulk. They expected to find cowering mortals. Instead, they found silence. The corridors were littered with the remains of demons, their bodies not just hacked apart, but cauterized by a fire that smelled of ancient cedar and Mediterranean salt. There were no bolt shells, no chains-word teeth, only the distinctive, heavy drag marks of chains. On the rusted bulkheads, a single symbol was etched in the soot, a red, jagged line. To the berserkers, it was a brand of heresy. To the few surviving ghost stalkers who had somehow endured the millennia, it was a signal that the father of their discipline was still walking the path of vengeance. Kratos has become a mythic anomaly within the warp, a god of war who refuses to acknowledge the divinity of his surroundings. He exists in the interstitial spaces of reality, a nomad of the nihilists. He has seen the tyrannid swarms and found them mindless. He has stared into the Necron's green fire and found a hollow. To Kratos, the 41st Millennium is merely a larger, more complicated version of the Olympus he once toppled, a galaxy of petty tyrants play with lives they do not value. He carries the same blades, though the chains are now etched with the names of the world eaters he couldn't save. He is the only being in the galaxy who truly understands that the great game is a rigged wheel, and he is the only one patient enough to wait for the moment to break it. What is the value of a soul in a galaxy that has already sold its own? It is the question that haunts the Inquisition's secret archives. There are reports of a gray man appearing on the battlefield of Armageddon, where he was seen standing atop a mountain of orc corpses, staring at the sky as the Red Angel descended. Witnesses say the demon Primarch paused in his flight, a flicker of ancient, agonizing recognition crossing his monstrous face before the gray man vanished into the smoke. Some say Kratos is looking for a way home. Others believe he has realized there is no home left to return to, that he has become the permanent, silent conscience of a universe that long ago traded its conscience for a gun. The screen fades to a deep, bruised crimson. We see a final image, a single, battered World Eater pauldron, white and blue, with a crude red stripe painted across it. It lies half buried in the dust of a dead world. The wind howls, a sound that mimics the distant clank of chains. The Spartan's journey did not end with the explosion of the Conqueror. It simply moved into the shadows of the never-was. He is the Ghost of Sparta, the hatcher of the World Eater's regret, and the god who refused to be worshipped. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the war has a shadow that even the gods are afraid to touch.